Hey everybody, Michael here from Avesi Stormwater. In this video today, I wanted to share with you a conversation that I had with Ryan Godfrey about ecology and gardening with native plants. This is a conversation that we had on Zoom, and I actually recorded it on Zoom, but for some reason it didn't record me. It only recorded Ryan, so you're going to see a lot of Ryan's handsome face here. Now, to break up the video, I did try to add some photos, references, resources based on what we're talking about at that specific time. I also am going to add timestamps to this video. So if you want to skip ahead to a conversation, I've tried to timestamp the video based on what we're talking about so you can skip ahead to the information that you want to hear about. And for those of you who don't already know who Ryan Godfrey is, he's an ecologist from Toronto. He's somebody that I heard him present at a talk one time, and I was like, I definitely got to meet this guy. He's got such a huge knowledge base. It was great to ask him questions and just get into the nitty gritty of ecological gardening. Now, most of the content sharing that I do is on my Instagram page at Avesi Stormwater. On there, I talk about things like rain gardens and drainage and ecological landscaping. I've also got my book, The Modern Rain Garden, which I wrote so people can approach their rain gardens with confidence. Now, I'm going to put a link to the book in the description below. It's also available on my website and on Amazon. Now, with that being said, let's get into the video.
You were just talking about people telling you that they plant natives and then the plants eat them, or the animals and things eat them, and you were saying that that's kind of what they're there for, and that's my mentality exactly. So, talk to me a little bit about your experience when you come across customers or people who are kind of afraid that their plants are going to get eaten. Like, how do you deal with that?
It does happen a lot, and obviously, like, I always try to approach with empathy and understanding, right? That people put an investment into this. There's a money investment, sometimes there's a time investment, it could be an emotional investment too. Like maybe they are literally sad and disturbed that their plant is having a rough time. And that those are all real feelings. But yeah, I think the important thing to consider is like the bigger context. Like, why is this happening? Why did that rabbit go straight to that witch hazel and nom it all down, even though there's a whole bunch of other plants around? And to me, the wildlife telling us what their preference is, what's the most nutritious food. And I mean, listen to them. Let's listen to them. And so
Yes.
rather than like being dismayed by that, I would say, okay, there's some things that you can do to protect your plants. So you could put up a fence. You could plant thorny bushes around, like raspberries, for example. Um, you could you could sort of layer things, or you could, if it's insects like slugs and stuff, like maybe you want to do raised planters. But the other thing that you could do is go out in your community and say, hey, all of y'all, let's all plant a whole bunch of native plants, and then the wildlife will have plenty to eat.
Yes, and then it's not so much of a taking a big dent out of one landscape. It's kind of spread throughout. That's a similar approach that I take. I'm big on biomass and biodiversity. So my mentality is to pack as much biodiversity into the space as possible. So even if something, we'll use the rabbit as an example, that lives under your porch, which there's millions of homeowners who have rabbits and whatever under their porch. I was one of them before I moved. And we had clover all over the place. The kind of ground, I just let the clover kind of do its thing. And the rabbits would eat it. And I loved that. I'm saying, okay, I've got more than enough here. Like, you're not going to be able to eat it all. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, I kind of relate it to money a little bit. There are some people that when they get a lot of money, they become very charitable, right?
Mm.
So they are more likely to give the money away, and it doesn't take such a dent out of their pocketbook, if you will, when they have so much of it. So that's why my mentality is always pack more biodiversity and biomass in there so that it's not so much of a detriment when it does get eaten.
Mm, mm.
Now, how about this one? On the other side of that, I had a consultation with somebody a couple days ago. It was a customer that I had done some landscaping for, and they had, I think it was Black-eyed Susan, but the Black-eyed Susan had got to the point where we all want Black-eyed Susan to get to. It's a biennial, right? So it can kind of
Mm.
there's a chance that in a couple of years it won't be there. But
Mm-hmm.
it got to the point where it was like self-seeding and proliferating well, and it was kind of spreading.
Mm.
She took that as like a bad thing, because we planted 3 to 5, and now all of a sudden there's a whole big swath of it, and she says, oh, it's just took over. I want to get rid of it. I want it all to go. And that's a real tough one for me too, because in my mentality, it's doing exactly what we hope it would do. So do you have any experience with this?
Yeah, yeah, over proliferation. Yeah, it can be an issue, sure. And I can understand too, like people like variety, especially in their gardens. They want to have a lot of different colors, a lot of different species blooming at different times. And you don't necessarily just want to have all black-eyed Susans. I get that. Understood. But yeah, I mean, for one thing, like black-eyed Susan you mentioned is biennial, does not have a very deep tap root. And so you could just pull them up. You could pull up half of them. Why not? And pot them up, give them to friends. That's what I would say. But leave a bunch, because like you said, they're not going to be there next year unless. And here's the other part of that. I really like to listen to, what are the plants telling me? What does it mean that this plant is proliferating year after year? So black-eyed Susan in particular, if you know a little bit about its ecology, is it's early successional. So it shows up in sunny meadows and prairie type areas that are in the first and second years after a disturbance. So if they're showing up year after year after year after year, what that's telling me is your site is being disturbed year after year after year. So the soil is getting turned, those seeds are coming back. You're not getting a thick layer of leaf thatch that's suppressing the growth of black-eyed Susan. So it's not progressing to that third, fourth, fifth year of succession that I would want to get to personally as an ecological gardener. So I would cue into that and ask myself, like, what is the disturbance? What's going on here? Why is black-eyed Susan coming up and telling me that this ecology is resetting every year?
Yes, I love the intermediate disturbance hypothesis thing in the landscape. And when I first got into the planting world and the ecology world, I was so far on the side of no maintenance or interference ever. It was like ultra primal, like, you know what I mean? Like humans weren't, out there gardening and tilling things thousands of years ago. So let's try to go back to that and just never touch anything. But
Hmm.
then nature is in its own way disturbing landscapes, right? Whether it's fires, droughts, big animals, herds, whatever. So if we create a situation where there's no disturbance ever, that's unnatural in its own way.
Hmm.
So when you look at managing landscapes, do
Hmm.
you ever find a situation where you want to like put in some man-made disturbance, if you know what I mean?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a time and a place for that for sure. And to be clear, like my philosophy is that human beings are a really important player in the garden. Like I think that humans are one of the wildlife species that interacts most with the garden, and the human should be doing that in the way that makes sense for them. So a harvest is a kind of disturbance in a way, but that's also a beautiful gift and a function that is going to bring you back to the garden over and over again. So yes, you should be doing that. Um, Also, like trees come down, or sometimes they come too close to your building, or there's hazards in some way. So I think there are ways of taking a tree or part of a tree down, but leaving the wood there, leaving some wood to rot, to decompose, to provide habitat. I've also heard this thing about well, you can leave stumps at various levels, and all sorts of different insects and birds will interact with stumps. But then another thing that I've seen people do is so in nature, trees will fall over and then their roots will pull up and they'll cause a big hole on one side. And that hole is a little microclimate that it can become a puddle in the spring. It can, have moss growing around it. And so in some cases, I've heard this described as hummocks and hollows. So the
Mm.
hollow is the sort of hole that's formed by the root ball, and then the hummock is the sort of mass of earth that follows the root ball. And creating hummocks and hollows could be a really great way to plan in microclimates into your little garden. I imagine that you would find some interesting wildlife species using that feature.
Absolutely. I love that mentality because it creates little pockets of differentiation that wouldn't be possible on just a flat plane. And that's one thing that I noticed as kind of a byproduct of the scrape, shape, and plant rain garden method that I use is a lot of times I'll take soil out of one area and kind of
Mm,
build it up on the other area to create some sort of little berm or kind of semi dam or whatever it might be. So I am creating this kind of undulation throughout the landscape, and I noticed that um, you get different erosion patterns, you get different wind patterns, and this is all within a span of a residential front yard. You get so much little different pockets. So uh, that's a great way to do that. Would you consider like Huglekultur kind of berming a good way to do that?
I've heard of that Huglekultur. Is that when you have like a bunch of sticks or wood and you kind of pile earth around them and you're
Yeah.
creating this like big biomass swale, right? I've heard amazing things about it. I've seen pictures of it on Instagram in permaculture context, and I understand you can pack a lot of biodiversity into a little micro environment like that. I think it's smart. Yeah, it seems not only like philosophically it seems to make sense, but I've seen practically that people are able to grow pretty amazing gardens around that type of architecture. Haven't
Yes.
tried it personally myself, but I would like to give it a try.
Yeah, it's kind of like built in a little water reservoir nutrient giver packet because there's dead and decaying wood under the soil that you're kind of accelerating that process and creating a little loop in the landscape there. I'll share
Mm,
anecdotally my experience with Hugel. So it was one of the first rain gardens that I built. We had um, a a border we took out. It was like wooden beams. You know those like cedar beams that are not round, but they're not square. They're like round sides but square on the
ah,
top.
yes, yes.
But they're cedar.
Yeah.
Uh, and typically, when you do Hugel, you kind of steer away from cedar because of the natural uh, allelopathic chemicals that are in cedar,
Okay.
right? So half of this side was done with cedar, and the other half was done with, ash or maple or oak or some more standard Hugel wood. And I
Mm,
found that things did grow better on the side that wasn't
mm,
cedar. So
mm,
that's
mm,
not really a very elaborate study. It's pure
mm.
anecdotal, but I did notice that. And then I thought, why is this happening? And I was like, well, maybe it's because this is cedar.
Yeah, yeah, I would believe that. Cedars really only like to let other cedars survive around them.
Yes.
They tend to create monoculture, which, yeah, that's one kind of nature that's out there.
Yeah.
Obviously, cedars can be very productive and excellent habitats in some circumstances, but yeah, they're all full of kinds of resins and
Hmm.
smelly things and oils and stuff like that. Yeah, clever architects in that way.
Yeah. It makes for an amazing building product for humans that way. It's
Definitely.
naturally decay resistant.
Mm, mm,
Yeah.
heard that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned the taproot of the biennial black-eyed Susan, and roots are something that I've kind of been doing a little bit of research on this winter
Mm,
because I don't know if you've seen this, the graphic of the plants and then the roots underground, and it has like some of them are up to like 12, 15 feet of roots.
yes, I know exactly which one you're talking about.
Yes.
I'm trying to
There's a name
remember.
for it.
Yeah, it's prairie plants in particular, and I'm trying to. It was a graduate student, I think, at the University of Michigan, that illustrated that as part of her master's thesis, I believe. And the picture is everywhere. Everyone shares it
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. And what I was kind of got from that was these plants work so well at regulating moisture because they're able to pull moisture uh, from so deep, and they put so much biomass down into the earth. But I was reading somewhere that the vast majority of the root biomass that's actually active, that's actually pulling water, is only in the top like 20% of
Hmm.
this. So the bottom roots might not be as active water straws as we think they are.
Hmm.
Do you have any insights into that or any thoughts on that?
Well, I can imagine. I've actually got the image here. I found it, and the that graduate student I was mentioning, their name is Heidi Natura. What a great last name to be sort of a celebrity in the nature
Yeah.
world. Um, yeah, I'm guessing that what's probably going on there is that those deep roots are are working during droughts in particular. Like when the water table goes really low, that's when those roots are sort of doing their thing. But yeah, well, I'm guessing that most of the time, like prairies don't dry out all the time. They have a dry season and they have particularly dry years with extremely dry seasons. But um, for the most part, yeah, I imagine that those shallow roots are doing their thing. The other thing that I've heard about that is that there's an interesting plant behavior that can happen where, like, if you're growing prairie plants at home, but you're watering them frequently, twice, three times, maybe every day, or like a couple times a week, they won't grow those deep tap roots. They will go shallow. And then when you get that drought, they don't have those deep roots to rely on to get down to that water table, and they will experience more wilting, more crispy leaves. And so, yeah,
Mm,
got to be a bit careful about that.
yes. That's one of the main reasons why once the establishment period is over, and even during the establishment period, I would say I'm a little bit more harsh on plants than most people. I don't really want to be watering them and babying them. I want them to feel stress. I want them to be in competition with each other because I don't believe there's a living creature on this earth, plants, human, animal, whatever it is, that can reach its full potential without some amount of external stress.
Hmm, hmm.
So that's what you've described is that's just a great example of why not babying plants really is a way to help them create resiliency and instill longevity into the landscape.
Totally agree. Also means you can go on vacation.
Yeah.
Like if you have to take care of your plant every day, then like, well, I hope your neighbor is ready to look after it when you want to, head
Yes.
down to the Caribbean or whatever.
Yes. And this notion of uh, no maintenance or minimal maintenance um, is one that I kind of struggle with because I love the I won't even call it maintenance. I'll call it management. I love that. For me, the management is more important than even the plan or the design, right?
Hmm.
Because the plan, the design is static. Once it's on paper, it's on paper. The management is kind of where the landscape comes to life over time, I think. So um, when minimal landscape is kind of or minimal maintenance is like a requirement, it can be a little bit of a struggle for me. How do you kind of approach that one?
Yeah. Again, like to me, I frame it at the very beginning that I say that a garden is a place where people and plants are in a relationship, a reciprocal relationship with each other. And it's an active relationship. It's a continual relationship. So I think the like the best gardens are the ones with very active gardeners. That's just the way it is. Like you got to be out there doing something. And like there's ways to be like minimally disturbing. But I think it's good. I think it is really good. I spend a ton of time out in my garden. I've always got my little fingers in there. I'm doing something. I'm looking at things. If you're not paying close attention, then you're not going to be able to learn the things you need to learn to become a better gardener. So, yeah, I to me, that idea of no maintenance gardening is kind of it's a bit of a cop out. Is to me, it makes me feel like, well, in the case of house plants, like if you want a no maintenance house plant, like we might as well just get a fake plant. Like what's the why bother having a living, breathing organism that produces flowers, has all of these interactions with other pollinators and wildlife if you don't want to also have a relationship and an interaction, an active one. Like you're missing out on a huge portion of what this thing is about if you've decided to completely remove yourself from the equation.
It's so true. It's so true. Yeah, I think that's the main reason that I struggle with it, because it's hard for me to relate to somebody who doesn't uh, want to kind of get dirty and, like you said, get their fingers in there and observing. Like most of the time I spend in my garden um, is observing. Like I might spend uh, 10 minutes observing and then 1 minute actually doing something. But
Mm,
that 1 minute that I actually do something, I have 10 minutes worth of information, and you can scale that, right? It might be an hour of viewing and 5 minutes worth of actually doing something. But that 5 minutes, it only takes me 5 minutes because I know exactly that thing that I need to do to get kind of what I'm after.
mm. I think that's a good way to do it too. Yeah, I think a lot too. I always, before I get in there and do something, whether that's pulling weeds, pruning, adding leaves, removing, whatever, I always ask myself, like, why am I doing this? What is the, I don't want to just be doing it because it seems like that's the right thing to do, or I don't know, like the folks on Home and Garden Television Canada do it that way. Like,
Yeah.
I want to be doing it because it has a real meaning, a purpose. It makes sense in this place, in this moment, to be doing this particular task. And then I'll go to
Yes.
town on it. And I like, once I've made up my mind, then like, yes, this species of weed is kind of taking over. I gotta do something about that. So
Yeah.
here's how I'm gonna do it. I'll get my tools and go ahead and do it.
So when you do weeding, now that we're talking about it, are you of the school of get in there and dig out the root, or are you of the school of cut it off at the soil and kind of put it at a competitive disadvantage, so to
Mm,
speak?
mm, mm. Yeah. Again, I think it's going to depend on the context, the timing, what else is going on. Like, so I don't do any weeding in my container garden up on my sixth floor balcony, because if anyone shows up there, like they get to be there. Like, I had a
Yeah,
Canada
yeah, yeah.
Goldenrod show up in one of my containers, like, you get to do your thing. You're going all the way to flowers, seed. You're great. But in my community garden plot, where I've got crops, I've got vegetables and herbs and other perennial native plants that I'm trying to give them their best shot to succeed. And sometimes, yeah, I do get weedy species like chickweed, galansoga, that come up, and they will really like take over all of the light landscape essentially, and they're not really giving the plants that I want to succeed a fair chance. So yeah, I'll go in there and pull up what I can, get the roots if you can. Like, it's I don't want anyone to ever take on an impossible task. Like, if it's not possible to get it, sometimes it totally is enough just to like knock back the weeds, give your perennials a chance to like to grow up, get higher up than the those weeds will ever be able to get anyways. And then, by the time the weeds come back the second time, they're not going to have as much light because your perennial wildflowers and grasses got to it. So it's a little bit of help. You're sort of like tipping the balances a little bit. I think that's a lot of what you can do as a gardener in an ecological garden setting, is just tip the balances a little bit one way.
Yes, yes. I love that tipping the balance thing. That's kind of when I say put one at a competitive disadvantage, that is exactly what I mean. And I love that. I can tell that you're a true plantsman when the start of every answer is it depends, because it totally does. There is not a situation where a blank slate answer is relevant. It's so true. And as I'm asking you these questions, I'm like, I'm thinking to myself, there's no straight answer to that. It's going to be one. It's going to be a combination of things.
Yeah, even from year to year in the same community garden plot. I've done the same community garden plot 4 years in a row now, and I get different weeds coming up every single year.
Yep.
It's just the moisture is different, the timing of the seasons is a little bit different. So
Yep.
you got to become that local expert. And this is where I tell people, like, okay, technically I'm a botanist. I'm an expert in plants because I studied at a university and have letters next to my name. But that doesn't mean that I will never know your garden space better than you. The local expert who's actually there observing, has been there for season after season, has seen that one time that a Cooper's hawk came in and took out some little finch or something. Like, you've got that local expertise that nobody else will ever have. So anyone can become an expert in their own garden. It's just a matter of observing, documenting, learning, and continuing to learn. It never ends.
Yes, I agree. You mentioned Goldenrod, the Canada
Oh,
Goldenrod.
yeah.
And the when you said if you have made it all the way up there, then you get to be there, which is something that I've literally said to plants. I'm thinking, I didn't put that there. I don't really want it there, but there's none of those else anywhere around here, and you're there. So who am I to to take you out of that spot?
Yeah.
And like time and place, right? Like there's sometimes when uh, I would take it out based on what it is and where it is, or there's other times where I would happily leave it.
Totally.
I was told by a friend, this is like 2018 when I built a rain garden at my place, and what I did was I really like blank slated it, and I planted a few little plugs here and there, like a pittance of plants based on the size that there actually was, because I wanted it to kind of self-colonize and do its own thing that way. And this is probably around this time, maybe like April, May. And I see this little couple green things coming up. And I said to him, I don't really know what that is, but I think I'm going to leave it. And he said, well, that's Canada Goldenrod. You might want to be careful with that one. I might take it out if I were you. And I said, why is that? I think Canada Goldenrod is native now. And he said, yeah, but it's really aggressive and it's really going to take over the space. So I didn't take his advice. And by the second, third year, it was everywhere. So talk to me about your experience with goldenrod, because I know you're a big goldenrod guy.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it brings me back. I worked at the Royal Botanical Gardens as an intern for 1 year, and we had to take on an independent research project during our year, and mine was all about differentiating from Canada goldenrod, tall goldenrod, and giant goldenrod, which are all very, very similar, extremely similar species. So I spent a lot of time out there with those goldenrods, and yeah, I mean, the one thing that everyone will agree on, whether you love or hate goldenrod, is it's a pollinator magnet. Like literally in the later part of the year, September, October, sometimes even into November, like that's the plant to go to if you want to find bees, if you want to find butterflies of those late season. It's an absolute critical part of the monarch southward migration. Like that's the asters and goldenrods is what they're relying on to get across the Great Lakes, and then further down to their overwintering grounds. So it's a really, really critical plant. It does not cause allergies. A lot of people that I always have to tell people that the pollen of goldenrod is sticky and heavy. It does not end up on the wind, so it's not ending up in your nose unless you're literally sticking your nose in the plant, which it doesn't have much of a fragrance, so I don't know why you would be doing that. But a lot of people think that it's an allergen when it's actually common ragweed, which happens to be another native plant species, blooms at the same time, very mostly inconspicuous, almost invisible to those who don't have botanist eyes, and it's sending all of that windborne pollen into the air at the same time that's causing your seasonal allergies. But what I actually loved, Michael, was in your book, in the plant section, I think you came up with a very reasonable compromise for Canada goldenrod in a small space, which is just knock it back once or twice a year, cut back half the stems. You could dry them and just throw those into the garden as compost. If you took those stems over winter, that would be really great overwintering habitat for lots of different species of small bees. And then, like you were saying before, you're kind of putting it at a competitive disadvantage by just continuing to knock them back. So that's what I do. I've got a couple, again, that have showed up in a partly shaded area, and I know that Canada goldenrod does not take off in partly shaded areas. It does in full sun, but in part shade, it's kind of a slow grower. But I'm just keeping an eye on these 2 or 3 individuals that showed up. I know that they spread rhizomatically from their base, the base of the plant. So I'll keep an eye on them. At the beginning of winter, if I see a whole bunch of rosettes forming, I'm like, oh, okay, next year that might be a problem. So I might prune a couple of those off. Just keep an eye on it, understand the plant, understand what it does, and build a rapport, a relationship. You can compromise with these types of plants. That's my feeling.
Yeah, I love the observational mentality that you have and the relationship mentality that you have. I'm so similar to that, and that was kind of how I started developing the relationship with goldenrod. Was I saw all of the pollinators and different insects that were on it, and I'm thinking, okay, I can't take this away completely, so I'm going to have to find a way to kind of diminish it in some way. So what I did was the first year I and it, like you said, it spreads via rhizome, so there's like a horizontal stem that's just like half an inch onto the ground, and then all the vertical stems are attached to it. So if you
Mm,
pull on one, it's like the whole thing comes up. And I saw that I opened up the soil. There was a few other plants that I wanted that were damaged by me doing that. So I said, okay, I can't do that anymore.
mm,
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait for them to grow maybe 2, 3 feet where they don't have developed flowers or seeds yet. It's all just a green mass, and
mm,
I'll go down about an inch above the soil, and I'll cut them down.
mm,
That way, I'm I've allowed the plant to put energy into this stalk that I'm then taking away, so that in some way the plant's kind of like, okay, that hurts. I kind of got to reset here, right? Because that's all energy that it's spent doing that. And not only that, two other things happen. One, you don't disturb the soil that way. It's zero disturbance. And the other thing is you open up spaces, like you said, for other plants. So
mm.
I actually had um, some milkweeds that were doing great the first year that I planted them, and then the second year, I was like, where are all these milkweeds? I thought I had milkweeds. I peel the goldenrod back because it's big. It kind of falls over, right? Big droopy. It's almost like a bear. And I peeled it back, and there was these small little trying to make it milkweeds, and I said, okay, I gotta cut these back and kind of let them do their thing. So
Mm,
the year after that, once I was kind of more conscious of that, the milkweed did great again. So that's
yeah.
kind of why I leaned into cutting instead of pulling. It was a book called Garden Revolution by Larry Werner
Mm,
that
mm.
kind of taught me that one. I don't know if you've read that book.
I've heard that's maybe the third time that that's come up, which means that I now need to read it. So
Yeah.
yeah,
After the third
okay.
time, yeah, it was that book and Planting in a Post Wild World. That were the two books that kind of have framed my kind of uh, plants outlook.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. I love that. That's very similar to one of my sort of mentors on native plant maintenance is a member of the North American Native Plant Society, which we might talk about a little bit later.
Yeah.
But she's a kindergarten school teacher, and so she's used to like managing uh playground behaviors, shall we say. And sometimes, you get those bullies that are out there, and like the bully in kindergarten, like the bully is not a bad person. Their behavior needs to be managed a little bit so that they can thrive and everyone else can also thrive on the playground. And so that's how she told me about goldenrod and Canada goldenrod and the other sort of bully plants in her garden. Is she takes the same kind of approach of just
That's
adjusting
a
the behavior a little bit.
That's a great analogy because in order to be a full out bully, it has to be intentional,
Mm,
right? And it's the goldenrods are just doing what all plants are doing. They're trying to create more of themselves, which is, as far as plants go, a pretty common and noble aspiration.
mm.
Were there any other plants, bully plants, that she kind of mentioned?
Um, well, so Virginia waterleaf can be a bit of a bully in certain situations. Dry soil, part shade, can get pretty wild. The easy way to correct for that is actually the early shoots of that particular plant are edible. They're like asparagus, so you can blanch them, eat them, make a salad. So like there's a harvest for you, no problem. Um, Other kind of bully plants. I mean, fireweed, I've heard some people say that fireweed can take over, but that's very similar to the black-eyed Susan. This is an early successional plant, self-seeding, and if it's taking over, probably what you're just seeing is a snapshot in time of the successional series that's going to happen. And whatever, just enjoy those beautiful pink flowers. You can harvest fireweed as well,
Yeah.
by the way. And so I always think, obviously, look this up. Don't poison yourself. Don't die. There's lots of resources out there to discuss medicinal plants versus poisonous plants versus edible plants. But if you can find a harvest in your garden among your native plants, and particularly the aggressive ones, like that's just a no-brainer. Come on.
Yeah. And that's a whole other thing that I kind of I don't even want to, I'm reluctant to go down that road because I feel like there's a quietly there might be an obsession lurking there, is the use of plants as like medicinal plants. And
Mm,
there's,
mm,
you know, plants are on this earth for a reason. And
mm,
before, um, you know, the world was industrialized and everybody was after, you know, money and success and power, and people were just coexisting amongst each other with nature. um, Plants were used in a completely different way. Like I went to Evergreen Brickworks in Toronto,
mm.
and I was taken around on a tour by an indigenous elder who was talking about some of the plants that they use uh, in their medicines, and they were saying how goldenrod, actually you can make a tea out of the flowers and it treats like a urinary tract infections.
Yep.
And he even said, he's like, you can tell that it's for urine because the flowers are yellow, and like in
Yeah.
nature it's always like things communicate that way.
I've heard that too. It's called. I was taught that that's called the doctrine of signatures,
Right.
and it was a a part of medieval European medicinal herbal practice as well. To sort of, I think of it as, the philosophy is that this is the way that the creator is communicating to us humans
Mm,
um to tell us, like, yes, this is for this. The kidney shaped leaf is for your kidneys, and the heart shaped leaf is for your heart, and the lung shaped
right.
leaf is for your lung.
And
I
walnuts are good for your brain because they
Well,
look
those
like
are
little
gonna be great.
brains.
All
Yeah.
that. I I take a slightly different approach. Not to disparage that. That's, if that's what you believe, then by all means, that is, you can have that. I think another way to think about it is, there's so many plants out there, and so many different ways that plants can be used, that humans throughout history and in the present are gonna find tricks, little memory tricks to remember, this is for this, that's for that. And yeah, associations, any kind of associations like that, whether it's the smell or the shape or whatever. If it can help you remember the difference between whether this plant is good for that or poisonous for that or whatever, I mean, those are going to be pretty important mantras or little tricks or whatever to remember and pass on as well.
Yes. What you said before of the best the best gardens are those that are like actively managed, and I never really thought of it that way, but now that you say that I totally agree with it. And my when you first said that I was like, well, but my favorite landscapes are those out in nature and nobody's actively managing those. But those aren't what we aspire to have in gardens.
Mm, mm,
We aspire to have those elements of that and the sensations that those give you, but not that exactly. We
mm,
want to distill elements of that and bring that into the home landscape. And the only way that you can do that is by actively managing it. So
yeah.
I do agree with what you said there. But my worry is that, you know, the I'm going to kind of disturb the neighbors, that I'm going to
Uh,
slightly have to kind of, or gently say to him, um, you know, this is the way it's going to be. Like I can't keep it any neater than what it's going to be.
yeah. Yeah, we get that a lot. And there's a couple of things I could comment on there. One is, people are always um well, I think there's always fear of unfamiliar things. So if there's species or
Absolutely.
or growth forms or just things that, like, I've never seen this before, our first reaction to that is typically like, ooh. That's like, it's either like a fear or a disgust feeling.
Hmm.
Sometimes that expresses itself as anger.
Hmm.
You do get that,
Yeah.
regardless. And so so partly if it's an unfamiliarity issue, then that's quickly resolved by just, teaching a little bit. Like say, this is this really cool species. It's the host plant of whatever butterfly, or
Right.
I really love watching the way that it blooms at this time of year and hummingbirds come after it, or something like that. Teaching that
Yeah.
it's not unintentional. It's not a weed. This is a plant that I have here intentionally. It's I have a relationship with this plant. You could have a
Yes.
relationship with this plant too. That's thing number one. Then thing number two that I've been slowly and kind of reluctantly moving in the direction of is the idea. I don't know if you've heard of this one, of cues to care. Have you heard that terminology before?
I have, yeah.
So it came to me from a talk I watched a little while ago by uh, someone by the name Rebecca McMacken, who is managing a wonderful sort of naturalized landscape in New York City at Brooklyn Bridge Park. So this is an
Wow.
area where there used to be this gigantic concrete pier out that's like jutting out into the inlet there, and it's been derelict for like, I don't know, decades, and so the city has decided to naturalize some of them. So they pulled a whole bunch of soil in, and they've let it partially self colonize and partially planted, and she and her team there are managing it to maximize biodiversity, but also to make it a space where New Yorkers can go who don't have access um, to Central Park, to have another like natural space where they can go. And so what she talked about was this idea of cues to care. So especially in the places where people are going to be seeing and there's going to be a lot of traffic, she and her team will curate, the edge of a garden. Make
Mm.
sure that there's a nice clean edge there. And then if she's going to have a messy spot where there's a lot of chaos and spontaneity going on, a lot of opportunities for wildlife, maybe that's set back a little bit in kind of a thickety area that is back behind. And so cues to care, I think, can go a really long way to helping with those kinds of neighbors. those uh
Yes.
those yeah. So you can see, because the other thing that they don't want, I think some people literally just think it's like, well, I have to put in all this work and time and effort to mow my lawn and prune back my this and that, and my neighbor over there is just being lazy, which is
Yeah.
not necessarily true, because you've already said like you're spending a lot of time. You're actually spending a lot of time, and you're very careful and intentional, but they may not see that. And so if you can just put in a couple of little things where they can see, okay, actually, you know what, that guy is out there doing stuff
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Um, like it's like, shining your shoes, or like having a
Yes.
pressed collar, that kind of thing. It's like a little cue to care.
And I think I started doing that subconsciously. I did three things that come to mind. Was number one, I put in like a steel edge, you know those like the 4 inch kind of just a
Yeah.
straight steel edge, and I buried it, 3 inches. So it was just a neat little 1 inch of edge, kind of differentiating the garden to the lawn, because I kept about 6 feet of lawn facing the sidewalk.
Hmm.
And that was the second thing, was I kept some lawn just so there was a little bit of like a, hey, I got some lawn too. When your dog comes by, he can use the lawn, or you guys can stand on the lawn, or there's some lawn here, just so I'm one of you, right? And so those were two things. The third thing was, in the space that wasn't rain garden, it was kind of like the last blank space that I had. I took three burgundy coral bells,
Hmm.
and I planted them in like a 1, 2, 3, very very obviously intentional pattern,
Hmm.
to make people think, hey, there's some order, there's some recognizable
Hmm.
patterning
Hmm.
going on there. So maybe there is a little bit of intentionality to it. So that makes a whole lot of sense to me, what you just said.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think introducing a little bit of that familiarity, and like coral bells, like I don't think there's any problem with coral bells going invasive in this area. Same with like Hostas. Okay, I don't love hostas, but they're not going anywhere. They're just
That's kind
gonna
of what
be
I
where
that's
they
kind of what I
are.
said in the modern rain garden. Like, they're not great, but they're also not hurting anybody. Like,
Yeah, yeah. And people
yeah,
recognize them, they'll see that familiarity, and maybe it'll just make the difference between this is I don't understand any of this. This is all new and scary to me versus like, oh, okay, that I recognize. So
yeah,
I can connect on that. There we went to
yes,
the same plant shop once at least.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Well, and he basically convinced me through reading that book that if you have land, any amount of it really, then you
mm,
have space and you have the um, possibility of having a functional rain garden that will be wonderful.
absolutely.
And you could do it, but also you you could hire someone to give you some advice and
Yeah,
get the laborious part of it done. But yeah,
that's right.
it's a I think a very tractable thing that I could see a world where everyone's got a rain garden.
I would love that world. I see that world every night when I go to sleep. A lot of people that I have worked with, they say, oh, I know how to plant a garden. I know how to kind of maintain the garden, but what I don't really know how to do is how to shape this rain garden, how to turn this space,
Mm,
and contour it in such a way that's going to create that kind of rain garden with the inlet and the bowl and the outlet that we're kind of going for. So
mm,
what I've actually done is I will go in and kind of, I call it blank slating, where I'll take a lawn, strip the lawn, shape the earth, do some basic, shovel and rake earthworks, mulch it, put the stones in, get the water coming in, and then they kind of plant it themselves, which I
mm,
really like because
mm,
I'm a big believer in, like, going back to how we started with the investment of, like, if you're putting the time and energy and investment into planting it, then you're going to be more willing to observe it and
yeah.
manage it and love it. So
Totally. Yeah.
yeah,
You got to have that stake. Like someone's got to be responsible, you
yeah,
know?
yep,
And you can't be responsible for the gardens of all of your clients. That would be
yeah.
untenable.
Yes, I would need a
So,
completely other company to do that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I like that. It's almost like you're teaching your clients how to be responsible for um for at least a chunk of their property
Yeah.
in a good way. Yeah, and we can all, I mean, responsibilities sound like, oh, that's like I got responsibilities at work with my kids, with my relationships, all of that already. But
Yep.
it's a wonderful thing to be responsible for a chunk of land and to be able
Oh, it's
to see that be productive, to be to be increasing biomass. I loved the focus that you had on biomass, and
oh,
I think that's like a great place to start for folks. Like, just how can you expand the biomass productivity of
yeah.
your garden? That's like really, really nice, simple way to start thinking about it. Biodiversity is like, sure, yeah, let's talk about that. Let's get into that. But it's a little bit trickier, and it
Yeah.
changes all the time. But biomass, like, yeah, you can be responsible for managing the biomass of your property. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Biomass was one that came to me when I did an ecology course at the University of Helsinki for a summer. And there was like these guest lectures all the time, and we were going to this place and that place. And every presentation that we had, they were always talking about biomass. And
Mm,
this was like a word that when I did my undergrad, it was like a word that you hear in an ecology course 2 or 3 times. But over here,
mm,
I'm hearing it every day, multiple times a day. So I'm like, let's kind of dive into this because clearly this is like the ultimate health indicator
mm,
that they're using landscape wise, where, if you want to regenerate a landscape, biomass. If you want to curb erosion, biomass. If you want to get
mm,
um, more ecology into the space in terms of like pollinators and birds and insects and whatnot, biomass. If you want to
mm,
absorb
mm,
water into the soil and build soil,
mm,
biomass. It's like, okay,
mhm,
this
mhm,
is this is a concept that you know
mm,
needs to be
mm.
kind of explored a little bit more. So
Not
it's,
to mention carbon too. Carbon
oh my
sequestration,
goodness.
if like
Yeah.
that's biomass of plants is directly proportional to carbon sequestration as long as it's not ending up back in the atmosphere. But I don't think a lot of people are burning their leaves
Yeah.
or vaporizing them. So yeah. No, it does relate and it's also like visually obvious. Like if your visual
Yeah.
field is full of green, then you're doing the thing.
Yes. Yeah. You can see it right there. It either is or it is not.
Yeah.
Yeah.